Hey, it's Professor Wham. This is the next installment of my articles. This is the first opportunity I've had to do this. I'm wearing headphones today because there's lots of noise going on outside. The weather here has been crappy, so today's been the first day in a while that people have been able to mow their lawns and stuff. Anyway, so this is a article that is entitled Capturing the Unseen Gaze, Memory, Power, and Meaning. I wrote this before I even graduated from my PhD program. So it reflects a kind of skepticism that had begun to seize me just simply because of my experiences, not only in academia, but also in the process of my research. That's what happens sometimes when you're dealing with different levels of bullshit. Whether it's dealing with various members of the contact community or the paranormal community, or dealing with various factions of the academic community. It seems pretty much that wherever people are, crap is. So anyway, that will explain the tone of this. Nonetheless, I think that there's a lot in here that is interesting because I found that a lot of the issues surrounding photography, because this is really about photography and about the phenomenon of photography, and the phenomenon of images, basically the phenomena of images and how images are received, how people want to talk about what they've experienced, the use of images in trying to not just simply, take a picture so that you can prove that you saw something, like of a UFO or of a Bigfoot or of a ghost, but also the use of photography and images in order to try to illustrate what one has seen or thought they've experienced. And I found that there were similar issues that emerged in different areas. And so what I was trying to do was combine not only issues of image and issues of the gaze, such as you might find it in paranormal phenomena and paranormal photography, but in other areas where photography has been used, whether it's in documentary photography, whether it's in one of the texts that I used was the text by Ronald Ostman called Photography and Persuasion, Farm Security Administration Photographs of Circus and Carnival Sideshows, in a wonderful book, which I think is out of print now, which was called Freakery. And it was about the phenomenon of sideshows and the depiction of freaks and its relationship to the relationship of sideshows to, various racial tropes and also ideas about normalcy and biological issues of biology and science in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's actually a fascinating book. But there was this whole chapter that Ronald Ostman wrote about photography and the use of photography with regard to sideshow circus freaks, which is fascinating. And I also used two texts by Michel Foucault, who has come up in various of my paranormal discussions lately. I used both Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, and I also used a little bit of The Birth of the Clinic, because in Birth of the Clinic, Foucault discusses a lot of different things. I used that book actually in several of my papers and discussions. But one of the things it talks about are the images of the body, and the ways in which images of the body have changed, especially in anatomy and physiology, like over the last 300 years. and the use of those images in promoting the ideas of health and disease and things like that. And then in addition to Foucault's book, I also used an extraordinary little book called by William Staples. It was written in 1997, and this book is still prescient. So if you can get a copy of it, it's extraordinary. It's called The Culture of Surveillance, Discipline, and Social Control in the United States. As I wrote in my endnotes, this text written by a sociologist and criminologist who specializes in surveillance technology, this is back in 1997, he details the perceptiveness of Foucault's analysis by actually examining a materialization of the technologies of the panopticon in the utilitarian United States. Although not a conspiracy theorist, Staples' observations could give even a conspiracy skeptic pause. And of course, that's even more so now, right? If you want to look at this, and I haven't even gotten this to the right sort of place here yet. Hold on just a moment. All right, finally I got this to the right place. These are all pictures of items that are the types of photography that I kind of talk about or I mention in the paper. It's not a long paper. And the UFO picture is one of Edward Billy Meyer's pictures. It was a picture that was proven to be a hoax, but it's listed here. And then we have a picture here, a spirit photography picture at the far, I guess it would be your far right. This was one of the early pictures that was taken by what was his name, Mumler, who was the individual who first popularized spirit photography in New York City. What's the interesting thing about this text is that the individual, the young man in question in the photo is actually dead. It was not uncommon for certain forms of spirit photography to actually take pictures of corpses with a montage of their spirit above them, or maybe montages of dead relatives above them. Because this would be, a lot of people didn't have photographs in the late 19th century, and so this would be the last likeness of this dead person that the family would have. So this was not uncommon. In the lower left-hand corner, this is a alleged photo of a sighting, of that famous sighting of the Virgin Mary that supposedly occurred over this cathedral in Cairo, Egypt. I believe it was in the 1970s. I can't remember exactly, maybe the late 1960s. The image of the Virgin Mother is supposed to be this little kind of bobble-headed figure. I don't know if you can see that, immediately to the left of the central dome. And then this later picture underneath here is a photo of, supposedly a photo of a shadow figure that was also supposed to be a Bigfoot. And that's, of course, a common way in which Bigfoot is, quote unquote, seen in photography. So, I included these just as examples of the kinds of photography that we might be talking about. And in addition to the sources that I've already indicated, these are three sources that I rely on heavily in the book. I don't know what their availability is. I do think that the Apparitions book in the upper left is still available. It's called Apparitions of the Madonna at Avellino Sutra by Paolo Appolito. This is a great book if you get a chance to get it. When I was in my PhD program, actually both my master's and my PhD program, one of my advisors, principal advisors, and I think she was the director actually of my master's project, was Sandra Zimdar Schwartz, who at the time, and this was in the 90s, was the international expert on apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And she actually recommended this book to me. It's a translation by William Christensen Jr. It's a fabulous book. It's like one of the most amazing books. Apolito was an academic. He was an Italian. He had come to the United States. He had trained as a sociologist. He became interested in apparitions. He went back to this little town. It's actually a region in Italy. And no, it's in Spain. I'm sorry, I am so wrong. It's in Spain, and he began studying the sightings. This was an area that was known for its kind of traditional sightings of the Virgin Mary. They had their own sightings that were like independent of some of the like more widely known sightings. And this is a book that he wrote about his experiences. Now, in some ways, he was an anthropologist and sociologist. Some people, think he went native. What actually ended up happening is that he abandoned academia. It's not that he converted to Catholicism particularly, but he became aware of the fact that the stories of the Virgin Mary in these villages was more important than sort of the hype around these things, and that he was treating human beings as subjects and as objects of study, and it bothered him a lot. He ended up marrying and joining one of these villages and just ditching academia entirely, because he became convinced, while he was never convinced that there was an objective reality necessarily to all these sightings, he became convinced that the meaning of the sightings was more important than their objective reality, and that was something that Western academia didn't get. And if you go actually to the description of this book, you'll just get, the academic description. There's this whole subtext in the book that they don't discuss because it's not academically fashionable. But anyway, it's a great book. It's one of the best books about the social impact and political impact, and this is on a local basis, of paranormal experience that I've ever read. It really influenced the way in which I do things. Then you have this wonderful book, Ghosts in Photographs by Fred Gettings, probably one of the best graphic histories of spirit photography that has ever been written. I highly recommend it. I think you can still get it. It's kind of a photography book, sort of like a coffee table book, but the text is extraordinary. The amount of research he's done, it's amazing. It's just read it. And then, of course, the Billy Meyer story, Spaceships of the Pleiades by Cal Korff. I know that in some places, Cal Korff is controversial because he's a skeptic, and because he went undercover and pretended to be a follower of Edward Billy Meyer in order to get into Edward Billy Meyer's good graces, and as a result of that was able to get some of the backstory of Edward Billy Meyer and access to photographs, which he was able, and this was in the 1990s, was able to easily prove many of them to be hoaxes, many of the more famous ones to be hoaxes. And of course, that will make him persona non grata for a lot of people. But here's the interesting thing. In this book, he talks about his experiences with Edward Billy Meyer and how he came to believe that Edward Billy Meyer had some legitimate experiences, that there was something real going on there. And what Edward Billy Meyer had done was in many cases, create pictures that he hoped would convince and illustrate what he had experienced, rather than rather than actually take pictures of what was actually happening. He had created montages and scenarios as a way of trying to convey the immensity of the meaning of his experiences to others. So it wasn't that he thought Edward Billy Meyer was just a charlatan, all right? It wasn't like that at all. It's actually a really interesting book, especially for a skeptic to write. Now, I haven't kept track of Karl Korff, so I don't really know where he's at now in terms of all of this, but that's the upshot of this book. So it's an interesting book to read. So the rest of the sources I'll go into as I approach them, but those are the principal sources. The technology of photography and film have been used extensively in the 19th and 20th, and now we know the 21st century, of course, now it's digital, to capture, record, deploy, and solidify the boundaries of human and otherworldly difference, providing a mechanism whereby to both capture and mystify memory, self, and other. In their fascinating study of the history of photography in National Geographic, Catherine Lutz and Jane Collins noted that the history of photography in the West can best be described as a story about looking. Photography, particularly the history of photography in the freak show, was a recording technology that was accepted as an objective augmentation of the eye. Most people, quote, were willing to accept as objective and true any evidence that was captured by photography, despite the fact that from very early on, photographers figured out how to augment and hoax effects, either by manipulating elements of the equipment itself or by staging shots with subjects or environments that then would be recorded by the photographic film as if it were real. And by the way, the book by Catherine Lutz and Jane Collins is called Reading National Geographic by the University of Chicago Press, 1993, if you want to look that up. In fact, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote about the technique of the photograph, which for him confirmed the Cartesian split of matter and form so necessary for the scientific analytic, expressing his enthusiasm in a manner which startlingly evokes the vivisectionist, the taxidermist, the scientist, and the safari hunter, as well as ghost hunters and apparition, people who study apparitions. So basically, quote unquote, form is henceforth divorced from matter. We have got the fruit of creation now, and need not trouble ourselves with the core. Every conceivable object of nature and art will soon scale off its surface for us. Men will hunt all curious, beautiful, grand objects as they hunt cattle in South America for their skins, and leave the carcasses as of little worth. I don't know, that sounds startling to me in the age of AI, but anyway. That the implications of photography could have serious personal and professional consequences can be seen in the story of William Mumler, a professional engraver for the Boston jewelers Bigelow and Brothers and Kennard in the mid-19th century, who, despite its relative expense at the time, often amused himself and his friends with a new technology. And this was, of course, the camera. He utilized the Roxbury photography studio and gallery of a friend, Mrs. Stewart, renting space and equipment, producing portraits of friends and acquaintances, generally free of charge. On the evening of October 5th, 1861, and this is, during the Civil War, Mumler reported an odd effect that seemed to be appearing on some of his photographic plates. According to his account, Mumler had secretly decided to determine whether it was possible to produce a spirit photographic record of a deceased person. He had set up the studio, held an unexposed, unopened plate in his hand for several moments while thinking about a dear cousin who had died some 12 years previous. Then he set the equipment up and took a self-portrait in the normal way. Mumler claimed that he had, quote, obtained on the plate an extraneous figure of a young girl whom he recognized as the image of his cousin. And this, I believe, is the picture that is used on the cover of the book of spirit photography. Now, news of Mumler's psychic gift spread quickly, fueled by the spiritualist fever of a nation torn by civil war and the loss of so many young lives to disease and violence. Soon, psychic investigators began to verify Mumler's claims. Dr. Gardner, one of the pioneering figures of spiritualism in Boston, observed Mumler's methods and, noting that Mumler needed only to be present at the sessions for the spirit figures to appear on the plates, reported that some portraits taken at the Roxbury studio, quote, had a second figure that could not be accounted for by the operator, unquote. Mumler produced hundreds of spirit photos, and these are pictures which include a shadowy, ghost-like double of a deceased person who was dear in life to the subject of the portrait. His most notable clients included Mrs. Britton, the famous British medium who claimed to speak for Beethoven, and Mrs. Mary Lincoln, who contacted Mumler for a private sitting after the president's assassination. According to the story, Mrs. Lincoln identified herself to Mumler as a Mrs. Tyndall, and Mumler took the photo assuming he was taking a portrait of a new customer. When the shadowy image of the late president emerged on the plate through the development emulsion, Mrs. Tyndall reportedly collapsed and confessed her true identity to Mumler. Mumler became so popular and his gifts with photography so intrigued and scandalized authorities up and down the East Coast that in 1869, New York City in 1869, he was brought up on charges of fraud. Along with the charges of swindling his customers, Mumler was also accused of something that would haunt future spirit photographers and actually cause some of them to give up their professions. Mumler was accused of, quote, dragging persons deceased out of their graves and joining said persons with their grieving parties through the mechanism of photography. In short, Mumler was charged with violating, penetrating the sacred boundary separating life and death, peering into the void, and resurrecting, necromantically invoking, through the agency of a camera lens, the spirits of the dead. Namely, he was accused with a type of witchcraft. Somehow he was both defrauding his customers and violating a boundary sacrosanct, which would imply that there was no fraud, if you think about it. Mumler's supporters rallied around him and attested to his personal integrity, psychic abilities, and desire to unite grieving parties to some lasting memory and communication with loved ones. Quote, so strong was the independent evidence of practical photographers who attested Mr. Mumler and of leading citizens who had been photographed, many of whom had received identifiable portraits of departed friends and relatives, unquote, that Mumler was acquitted. In an unprecedented move, Justice Dowling of the Tombs Police Court declared in his decision exonerating Mumler that the possibility of photographing spirits from beyond the grave was, quote, conclusively demonstrated by the actions, procedures, and testimonies of William Mumler and his supporters. Despite his public support, Mumler died in poverty and almost total obscurity in 1884. By the time of his death, capturing the spirits of the dead on photographic plates had become an industry, a capitalistic venture that targeted those who could afford to pay the price. Now, on February 14th, 2001, the program UFOs, the Best Evidence Caught on Film, was re-aired on Science Fiction Cable Network. Much of the show is based on Whitley Strieber's 1998 text Confirmation, in which the horror fiction writer and stated alien abductee purports to examine what he considers the best physical and psychological evidence for the possible incursion of UFOs and alien visitors into Terran atmospheric and mental space. But much of the show is actually dedicated to the ease by which both photos and film of UFOs can be hoaxed by charlatans due to advances in film and video technology. And this was covering the late 1990s to the very early 2000s. Okay. Throughout the feature, attention is continuously drawn to a series of 17 videos that were shot over Mexico City during the extraordinary total solar eclipse of 1991. These videos, all amateur, which reportedly come from 17 different locations in Mexico City and were all shot during the eclipse or immediately thereafter, show what appears to be a spinning globular structure which seems to cause significant disturbance of the surrounding atmosphere, and in one instance actually accelerates and disappears from the frame altogether. Now, the show finally focuses on anomalous film and video, which in the manner of spirit photography of the 19th century exhibits unknown figures or shapes that periodically appear in the filmed work of individuals who act as mediums. These images, which can only be discerned if the film or video is played frame by frame, Stella Lansing actually is one person that they refer to in this section of the documentary, captures these shadows of aliens that apparently might be anywhere, but can be seen by the right person looking in the right place at the right time. And of course, this has become sort of the normal thing for talking about pictures of Bigfoot, or some of the spirit pictures of ghosts, or some of the kind of interesting photos of even UFOs or lights seen in the sky. So as Fred Gettings affirms in his history of spirit photography, precisely because it was considered a scientific technology, was thought to produce an accurate window into the realm of the dead, which, quote, sought to visualize the world of the hereafter in terms more appropriate to the material plane, unquote. Photographs provided an interface whereby the subject of the picture could gaze into a shadowy after existence which had been captured, spied upon, and through which a deceased loved one could be glimpsed gazing back, unquote. Gettings evokes the poignancy of a late 19th century American generation torn by civil war, facing dislocation and disease due to immigration and Western migration, losing family members that would never be seen again. A society facing, for the first time in this technology, the possibility that a literal visual record of a loved one could supplement memory, which is something that is perhaps difficult for our visually saturated culture to imagine or appreciate. Quote, spirit photography arose from a cultural sadness, a deeply experienced spiritual insecurity, and were taken as proof that a spiritual world did exist. I want you to think about that and about how images are used now. You know, even images that aren't real, and we know they're not real, that are produced by AI. The idea that worlds that we cannot even imagine can now be created, even if extra arms and legs are in the image. You know, things that we've never seen before can just be produced. At the same time, such photos did not also always produce the comfort that was intended. Gettings notes that cases such as that of Mrs. Z in Cheltenham, quoted below, were not uncommon in the early days of spirit photography. Quote, a week or two ago, a young woman came to get her portrait taken. She was recommended to me, being a spiritualist. She was in mourning. I took it. When she came for it, she cried and kissed it and went away. There was a shadow of a little girl on it, and she has been crying, as they say, ever since. They think it will be her death. Unquote. The portrait of the recently deceased little girl looking back at her gazing mother simply reinforced the sense of loss and helplessness. She could look but not touch. She could receive her daughter's disembodied gaze, but not gaze upon her in the physical world. And could her daughter see her mother's gaze in return? The author of the letter goes on to speculate whether it isn't better for people to allow their memories of loved ones to become distorted and fuzzy, quote, as we remember the best of them that way and don't have to be constantly reminded of our failings in their eyes, unquote. This discomfort of the photograph capturing the gaze of the other carried over into other realms in which photography dominated. Tom Bodkin notes that freak shows, and in freak shows, the forgotten and most popular general entertainment of 19th century America, in common with later standards followed by photographers for National Geographic, generally displayed photos in which, quote, the captured subjects look away from the camera, not meeting the perspective and expected gaze of the viewer, while at the same time, quote, portraits of each exhibit were available and would be inscribed with a personal message for an additional fee. Professional photographers carefully posed the attraction in their studios to promote the exhibit's staged identity. Listen how they're talking about these are people. They're called exhibits, unquote. Staged portraits in which the subject was deliberately set in contrast to accepted environments. For example, the Lion Boy was dressed in a tuxedo and posed, or What Is It? That was their identity, was dressed in a vaudeville clown costume, or Siamese twins were dressed in Sunday frocks and placed in front of an automobile that they would have difficulty getting into, might feature the subjects gazing directly at the viewer in a kind of ironic gesture. On the other hand, photos which illustrated the exhibit in his or her, quote, native environment, namely unclothed, with jungle backgrounds, or displaying unusual physical abilities, often show the eyes of the photographed subject averted from potential viewers. Freaks, while they're imitating acceptable people, are permitted to gaze back. If they re-enter their exotically depicted personal realms, they are not permitted that confronting gaze. At the same time, the viewer is given the photographic impression that he or she is gazing into, if you're the viewer, that you are gazing into, glimpsing a private world, in much the same way that spirit photographs were understood to be glimpses into non-physical realms. So, you can glimpse the unknown, unseen world of a freak. In the formulation of Lacan, I also use some of the theory of Jacques Lacan, the psychoanalyst that everybody uses but likes to hate. In the formulation of Lacan, and that's because, it's because of the way he wrote. But of course, we're only reading him in translation, but it's still the way he wrote. In the formulation of Lacan, such pictorial presentations, quote, eased the anxiety of viewers by both assimilating freaks into a world that attendees would find acceptable and categorically denying that said freaks occupied the same realm of subjectivity as their viewers. In other words, that they were as human as the people looking at them. Paolo Appolito, in his wonderful study of the ongoing Marian apparitions at Avellino Sitra, notes that the desire on the part of devotees to capture an image of the Madonna, and this is a phrasing that is used all the time. I mean, he doesn't use it. The people who are trying to capture images of the Madonna use it. It's revealing and instructive, quote, betrays an extraordinary change in the meaning of relations with the divine. Eyeglasses, binoculars, and photography capture the image of the Madonna as if they no longer let her offer herself to the chosen ones, but instead invade, like paparazzi, her private realm. The technological impersonality of the photographic medium optics, light, exposure, lens, electronic automatic mechanisms, changes relations with the divine, which is then assimilated to the world and even subordinated to technique of exclusions and preclusions. And here he is citing a definition of magic by Maurice Prédenise, who's an academic of the history of magic. Such activities are an attempt to bring about changes to man's advantage by deviating things from their own course to put them at our service. Distant and dangerous magical entities can now be controlled and bent to human will with a new ritual activity, photography. Hence, far from irreconcilable technological constraint is the transformation and modern version of magical constraint. The bound image of magic is now the captured image of photography. The Madonna does not seem to be able to escape from the chemical reaction taking place on film. Technology, a new magic constrains the Madonna to give in to the believer's desire for images. And if you think about that, that puts into a whole different light the fact that people are having experiences of things like ghosts and Bigfoot in particular that they can't capture. That our desire for images seems to be thwarted in some interesting way. Apolito argues that this state of affairs in which, quote, vision by technology ends up multiplying the image and making it available to everyone, definitively putting heaven on earth, eliminating any residual dimension of privilege in seers in their connection with heaven, problematizes Benjamin, and Benjamin is yet another theorist that I used, Walter Benjamin. I'm just referencing him here. I did not actually, I mean, there is a quote that I'm using from him. But Walter Benjamin is an interesting person to read, if you can get through his text, because one of the things he does examine is the use of images in capitalism and how that influences art, and how capitalism tries to desacralize art constantly. It tries to make art into a commodity, which obviously has fascinating implications for the present day. But anyway, so Benjamin's contention that the, quote, desacralization of social and aesthetic values went hand in hand with the progressive diffusion of techniques for the serial reproduction of objects and images, unquote, at least with regard to captured objects considered to be of religious or spiritual importance. Furthermore, as Apolito illustrates, while having a photo of the Madonna is not considered the same as actually experiencing a distant apparition, at the same time such a photo is not considered to be anything less than the Madonna. The Madonna is the Madonna, regardless of the relative photogenic clarity, distance, proximity, or obscurity of her captured form. Because one of the things that Apolito talks about is are the attempts by local people to get photographs of the Madonna, even if they're just getting photographs of stigmata or of certain statues that bleed, or of certain statues from which lights emerge, or of certain statues which occasionally will open their eyes or change the positions of their heads. All of these things are considered to be legitimate examples of the Madonna. Now, the sheer repetitive nature of the photos and the photo taking involves a kind of ritual rhythm, which involves the photographer in an act of seeing and of capturing the moment of being seen. Think about that with Bigfoot. In an act of seeing and of capturing the moment of being seen. And of course, Apolito is talking about the Divine Mother, but how many people have we all talked to who have encountered Bigfoot and have had this experience of being seen by Bigfoot, or they didn't see Bigfoot until they felt something watching them, and then they turned and saw something? Okay. In these instances, the subject taking the photograph desires to capture a moment of contact, a moment of seeing and being seen, in contrast to the previous examples wherein a particular direction of gaze was either lost or sought to be avoided. This is in the case of freaks, unless it could serve the purpose of what is called the regime of visibility, in which the viewer has the prerogative to both recognize him or herself in the captured other and deny that recognition. And this is something this is something that the critical theorist Homi Bhabha talks about, who, by the way, Homi Bhabha is the individual who sort of created a way of talking about what's called the subaltern. We don't really talk about the subaltern anymore, but Homi Bhabha was talking specifically about the colonized and colonizer, and how colonizers, people who were colonists, like to take pictures of the things that they colonized, the people that they colonized, the animals that they hunted in the vicinity of the colonized, things like that. It seems particularly appropriate at this point to consider Foucault's analysis of the growth and development of surveillance technologies in the West, especially when trying to understand the dynamic of the gaze. Foucault focused on the developing psychiatric, medical, and legal institutions as, quote, primary sites in which control over populations was achieved, unquote. He argued that these institutions exercise power, quote, not only by coercive control of the body, but by creating knowledge of the body and thereby forcing it to, quote, emit signs or to conform physically and representationally to the knowledge produced by these institutions, unquote. Cameras and photography play a crucial role in the systemic deployment of the normalizing gaze. Quote, in the perfect camp, all power would be exercised solely through exact observation. Each gaze would form a part of the overall functioning of power. Surveillance technologies, which are regarded as invaluable tools by law enforcement and corporations who feel the need to gaze at their employees, are often similar, if not identical, to those used by the more sophisticated UFO and ghost hunters. Real-world television, such as Cops, Survivor, and the more recent Temptation Island, so you can kind of see how far back this goes, ruthlessly and cynically exploit the notion that the visual image captures what is real. As gazes proliferate, it should not seem surprising that the conviction that technology can capture even unofficial knowledge persists. Careful examination of photography of images caught by camera can and has been and is used to classify freaks, deviants, racial and ethnic types, identify the perpetrators of crime, reverse or review an umpire's call on the field of play, and to provide proof of the existence of married, deceased loved ones, and extraterrestrials who it is said are surveying us. According to Lutz and Collins, the multiplicity of gazes present in this dizzying array of what can or cannot be, should or should not be observable is fascinating. Not because falsity can be presented as truth, because people have been doing that forever, but rather this fascination lies in how the presumed non-deviant observer, whoever that would be, must thereby acquire a knowledge for understanding themselves and the limits they must observe to avoid being classed with those on the outside. Carl Korff, a computer systems analyst who specializes in analyzing UFO photographic data, has gone on record as saying that the interesting conundrum about current photo and film technologies is that they are so sophisticated that it is possible for someone to hoax a film, video, or photo of a UFO event and no one will be able to tell. Even more true now. Perversely, although there are oftentimes artifacts, perversely that means that someone could take an actual picture of a real event and there might be no way to verify it. In some cases, even with the negatives, and how much more so the case with digital. Thus, photos and film of UFO events are almost worthless in terms of evidence. Think about that in terms of like the Tic Tac UFO, that kind of thing. The very sophistication of technology that is supposed to clarify and render definitive those moments captured with it, in the manner that surveillance cameras are said to work, problematizes itself by virtue of its ease in manipulation and duplication. And this is even more true with AI and deepfakes. Interpretation of unofficial photographed objects becomes less about what can be known than what is believed to be known, echoing the observation made by Lutz and Collins in their work about the history of the National Geographic photography. The photography has never been about objectively capturing objects qua objects on sich, or as such, in situ, but has always also been about the story said to be revealed in the objects captured. We gaze at objects or subjects, particularly at subjects that are othered in our gaze, in other words, that are not us, and both identify with and objectify away, oh yes, oh no. We feel as if we glimpse some secret knowledge about the subject while holding them safely away in the palm of our hand or in our phone. Such arguments seem to be obvious when examining photos of exotic natives in the pages of National Geographic or in freak show promotional material. However, the situation with regards to photos or unofficial subjects and objects is similarly complex, such as the Virgin Mary. Although it is definitely true that some, perhaps most, such photos are hoaxed or misidentified, the reasons why they would be so produced is not as obvious as it might seem. One could argue, for example, that all photos of freaks or native exotics are hoaxed, insofar as they not only represent the reality, the humanity of the subjected native in question, but both obscure and reinforce the power relationships of the gazer, who in these instances was often a colonial or a racial superior, a racialized superior gaze, viewing the captured photographic subject. In many cases, believers who want to convince others of their convictions do similar things. So believers who want to convince others of their convictions produce UFO photos and film. Many of these individuals are not cynically attempting to gain a following and so produce faked photos and film, but rather produce UFO images through the mechanism of photo and film as a reflection of a conviction already held. Somehow a photo can be duplicated and shared. The fact that it can be shared and duplicated with others renders the conviction visible, reinforces the sense of watching what cannot be commonly seen, proving that we are being watched. Paraphrasing the words of Apolito, such activities render the common man a seer. So Cal Korff exposes the hoaxing activities of the highly vaunted and controversial contactee cult Simjazi Silver Star, organized by Edward Billy Meyer and centered in Switzerland. Meyer centers the claim that he has been in ongoing contact with Pleiadian cosmonauts around a complex series of almost 1,000 photos depicting Pleiadian beam ships and so-called stills of his time-traveling adventures. Many of the photos are quite striking. In one, a massive ship seems to hover just behind a tree as the rays of a rising sun strike it from behind, casting the image into sharp relief. In another, 3 disc-shaped beam ships appear to be flying in formation against a picturesque alpine landscape, contrasting brilliant silver white against the vivid blue of the mountain sky and the brown-green of the forests and pastures beneath. Korff, utilizing a brilliant, if unorthodox, undercover approach, and he would never make it as a social scientist, which involved, as I mentioned at the beginning, posing as an enthusiastic Meyer devotee so that he could make it into the cult compound, covertly crept into the compound grounds at night to obtain samples of physical evidence. He claims to be ironically amused that he had to stoop to committing activities attributed to CIA operatives and or the aliens themselves in order to do this. Korff was able to collect enough photographs of his own and physical evidence to demonstrate the relative ease by which Meyer has hoaxed his photographic and physical evidence of contact. The book is pretty conclusive. I mean, it is. Still, Korff does not deny that Meyer may have had some kind of contact experience. He simply cannot provide no proof. Meyer often produced his photos after prospective believers asked him if he had any tangible evidence of his Pleiadian friends. Meyer's response parallels that of 2 famous contactees during the 1950s, George Adamski and Howard Menger. Both men produced obviously faked, even by the standards of the day, photos after being asked by reporters if they bothered to take a camera to their encounters, indicating that visual proof would provide the evidence needed. Both men came up with photos after being asked and yet showed a remarkable diffidence towards the photos themselves. Adamski just gave copies of the photos away, and Menger alternatively claimed the photos as accurate representations of his experiences or as deliberate plans by the CIA to spread disinformation about UFOs. Meyer reportedly, Edward Billy Meyer, often demonstrates a similar disregard of the photos in his collection, including excellent shots alongside grainy, indeterminate efforts, cataloging obvious forgeries next to those that would require computer analysis to demonstrate the fraud. Now, clearly in these instances, the point of the photos is not what can be known about the objects themselves, objects that are treated as subjects in this case, but rather what do the photos say about the person who created them, the persons who gaze upon them. UFO hunters such as Ellen Crystal and Britt Elders. Ellen Crystal, of course, if you recall, was the individual who took lots of photos at Pine Bush in New York. And she at the time was still doing this when I wrote this. They continued to collect and catalog photos, film, and videotape of unidentifieds, despite the fact that current technology renders such records almost superfluous. Lay UFO hunters continued to scan the skies with their cameras and video cams around Area 51, scouting for anomalous lights, despite the fact that the Groom Lake project has been closed by the military and relocated elsewhere. Although it's still a restricted area. They just don't do tests there like they used to. Wendell Stevens, one of Edward Billy Meyer's most faithful followers, boasts what many investigators, including Cal Korff, believe to be the largest collection of UFO photos and filmed images around the world, carefully cataloged in a manner reminiscent of the collection of animal and exotic trophies, the date, the type of UFO, the circumstances under which each image was captured. Surely in most instances the viewer is not gazing at anything except models mounted by string, misidentified terrestrial craft or natural phenomena, or ships flying overhead by virtue of double exposure, and yet there is a gaze present in the presented vision of the person who created the images for us then to look upon. And does not Meyer now gaze down upon his flock from his mountain in Switzerland, providing jobs and boosting the economy in a small farming village? Are the photos simply faked, or is there something true contained within them about what some of us want to see? Now, of course, there are many kinds of imagings possible, and many different forms of possible perceived contact and methods of perceived boundary-violating recordings. Ghost hunters and modern-day spiritualists regularly upgrade their technologies, posting collections of photos on the web, on TikTok now, on YouTube now. This was actually written before YouTube, by the way, which should show you how ongoing these concerns are. So ghost hunters and modern-day spiritualists regularly upgrade their technologies, posting collections of photos on the web and now on YouTube and TikTok with complex analyses, differentiating false ghost hits and camera artifacts from true anomalies. Even the U.S. government has had difficulty confirming contact and communication with and of Osama bin Laden. This is, of course, and this was true at the time, based on alleged video and audio tape evidence alone. It doesn't help, of course, that both bin Laden's organizations and U.S. intelligence agencies have the same equipment and know how and have the motivation to falsify such material. What do we believe when we see and encounter such information? I mean, seriously, with QAnon and false, deep fakes and all kinds of stuff now. I have witnessed a similar phenomena several times in my years of contact with both UFO and, quote, New Age communities. In one case, this was fun. In one case, a man came into the New Age store at which I have until recently worked and demanded to see the owner. I told him I would have to tell the owner, whose name was at that time Steve Thomas, which ironically was the name that Cal Korff used as an alias when he penetrated Edward Billy Meyer's compound. So I would have to tell the owner, Steve Thomas, what he would want to see Steve about. This man opened an attaché case, pulled out a couple of sheets of paper, and quite loudly declared, "I can't tell you, it's privileged information." After I had told them that there was no such thing as privileged information in the store, and he would have to tell me before he saw Steve, this was a procedure that the two of us worked out to deal with such events because they happened more than once. The man reluctantly relented and described to me what was going on. According to his account, he had been surfing the internet quite late and was trying to print downloaded information. Suddenly his printer went, in his words, a little haywire. Quote, I began to fiddle with it. It seemed like it lost power or something. Then all at once it started up again, and instead of printing what it was supposed to, it printed this. He held up the pieces of paper together. Now, what I saw was a series of roughly triangular forms made of sequences of letters and machine code. "Do you know who this is?" he demanded. I said, "I'm sorry, but I don't recognize anything or anyone familiar on this paper." He traced several of the lines together with a finger, indicating the face that he saw on the paper. "It's Metatron! You do know who Metatron is." I could tell he thought I was a spiritually inferior person. So I answered, "I'm assuming you mean the archangel?" "Yes," he replied in a tone that temporarily redeemed me in his eyes. "I believe I have received a message from Metatron and that I am to reproduce this image in order to demonstrate his existence to the world." Unquote. Now, this man was not a crazed idiot. He was nicely dressed, obviously had money, was to all appearances a businessman. An expensive inkjet printer, probably one of Hewlett-Packard's best, had generated this image. He was not trying to fake me out, so I got Steve after telling him the man's story. Steve was no more convinced than I that Metatron had caused itself to be printed in an attempt at visual contact, and so eventually, in the diplomatic manner that Steve has always been able to effect, and which I'm still working on to this day, the man was sent on his way. Later, when I described the image to a friend of mine who works in the computer hardware field, she said, "Oh, that's a fairly common printer artifact. It can happen when something in the printer interface in the printer when it interfaces with the internet and when that interface gets interrupted by a power surge." This was actually my friend Diane, who died in January of 2020, who told me this. I said, "Well, that explanation would only prove his point, wouldn't it?" And Diane laughed as she said, "Yes, it probably would." So basically, a power surge can cause it. 6 months later, the shop received a poster tube in the mail that contained a retouched image of Metatron, produced by the selfsame man, who, in retailing at $14 an image for anyone who desires to look upon the watching countenance of Metatron as he has revealed himself to us. In other words, Metatron gazed at him, now you can gaze back at Metatron. Steve filed the poster in the back room where such curiosities, we had a ton of them, were kept, with the comment, "Well, I hope he makes some money, having gone to so much trouble." Now, more recently, a woman came into the store with spirit photos of ghosts that she claimed had been taken at various haunted locations and cemeteries around the country. She was obviously deeply convinced of the objective nature of the images that appeared in her photos. She took the photos with a digital camera and then enlarged the pictures until the image appeared centrally located in the frame. Now, what it looked like to me, and Steve, who examined the pictures, and I think most people would see this now, was that she had enlarged the digital pictures until the actual pixels were exposed and mistook the shadow images of the pixels for her spirit. I said nothing, but Steve tried to gently explain to her what was happening in her pictures. She called him a stupid nincompoop and stalked out of the store. I've seen this happen actually with other types of digital, especially the really poor digital images. Cameras on phones used to be really poor and did these things a lot. Even something that was real, it was impossible to see it in some of those pictures. Now, a similar event occurred at a UFO conference that I attended several years ago during a forum facilitated by paranormal investigator Linda Moulton Howe. We know who she is. She has interesting and controversial beliefs about the relationship between instances of mysterious cattle deaths and narratives of the alien abduction of narratives, but she does know photo and film technology because she's worked with it for much of her life. She spent 45 minutes during this forum explaining to a largely lay audience the differences between video camera artifacts and actual anomalous images. "You have to understand the difference," she said, "if you want to get real proof about these things." One woman stood up and said, "Are you telling us that we don't know what we're seeing?" To which Howe replied, "No, I'm trying to help you get images that will convince others of what you are seeing. And that is the end of the paper. See, I did not finish the paper. This was a rough draft of the paper, but I still think it has a lot in it. So you can take with it and run with it and do with it what you will. And just a couple of little other examples here. These are from the endnotes. Now, ghost hunters always speak in these terms, and there's always a whole line of new technological devices that are being constantly developed. You can even get apps on your phone now that address how one might capture an authentic image of a ghost. Using EMF meters versus readings that can be caused by natural emissions. You can get these devices on Amazon. You can also use measuring instruments that are used by geologists and seismologists that measure ion and EMF output along geologic faults and formations. And of course, you can get like infrared stuff, all kinds of stuff now. And of course, just for those of you who do not know, Metatron is a fairly common name for the highest archangel associated with the Kabbalistic Sephira Keter on the Tree of Life. At the time when I was writing this, there were several New Age spiritual teachers, among them J.J. Hurtak and Melchizedek Drunvalo, who claimed to have contacted Metatron. And the conference that I saw Linda Moulton Howe at was, I believe, the Ozark, as I write here, the Ozark Mountain UFO Conference, which occurred in April 1992. Which you might be able to get videos of, I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, that's the second article. We're working on printed versions of these, or printed summaries at least of these. And I've started working on the third article, which specifically has to do with the politics of pain in UFO and abduction testimony. So this is Professor Wham. Have a good evening.